I just watched the new Matt Reeves Batman movie, The Batman. Let's start with spoiler-free impressions. I went into this with somewhat low expectations. I'm going to be honest and say that I'm not the biggest fan of Matt Reeves. I didn't really care for Cloverfield when it came out, and while I think his Planet of the Apes films are solid, they didn't captivate me like they did a lot of people. With that said, this movie is really damn good. It isn't perfect, but most of my issues are pretty superficial. This movie operates very well as a detective noir thriller and an action movie. Its technical elements are top-notch, and it manages to handle its thematic aspirations fairly well. Some of its thematic elements are a little uneven, and I think the pacing falters here and there, but by all accounts, this is a really great film that's worth seeing, especially in the movie theaters, if only for one scene. If you've seen the film, you know the scene I'm talking about. Out of 5, I think it's a solid 4, but I think the right viewer may go even higher. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend checking it out. Now on to spoilers. Well, first let's ask the question, is this the best Batman movie? And now let's not answer it, because between this and The Dark Knight, I think it's still too close to call. They're so incredibly different, but the fact that it's even in the conversation is pretty noteworthy. I think it'll come down to taste. But if this isn't the best rendition of the character on screen, it's definitely the second best. The film is an interesting look at what I would call a sophomore Batman. I'm not a comic book guy, but I think this draws on one or two Batman comics as major inspiration, but as for seeing this side of Batman on screen, this felt fresh. We either see him starting out in his prime or at the end of his reign, but this is a unique time to see the character. Even with the Dark Knight trilogy, we go from his origins in Batman Begins to a pretty well-established veteran in The Dark Knight. This movie feels like it would take place in between those two steps, and that was cool to see. He's incredibly competent, but also rough around the edges, and it's put to screen in a great way. Robert Pattinson is a great Batman. He brings a real weight to this rendition and intensity that feels fresh. I feel like the Affleck Batman tried to capture a similar vibe, but this one gets it right. Robert Pattinson is one of the best younger actors working today, and his portrayal of an angsty, vengeful Batman is pretty great. Batman is also portrayed as a highly intelligent, astute detective, something we don't see too often either. All of the other performances are pitch perfect as well. My minor grievances with Matt Reeves aside, I think he's a really great actor's director and is capable of getting fantastic performances out of his talent, and the Batman is a great showcase of that. Jeffrey Rush is a great Gordon. Barton Fink is a great mob boss in Carmine Falcone. Colin Farrell desperately needs an Oscar for his Penguin portrayal. He was a real standout, even among a cast of other fantastic actors, and I love the scene where they actually had him waddle like a penguin. Paul Dano as the Riddler was also pretty good, even though we don't get to see him too much. This is by design, sure, but it'd be like if we only saw Heath Ledger's Joker for like 3 minutes of screen time. It makes sense for this story, but I wish we somehow could have gotten more from him. I think Andy Serkis has the potential to be a great Alfred, and I hope he's actually in the next film. Zoe Kravitz is also very good as Catwoman Selena Kyle. All in all, really great nuanced performances, a standout feature of an already great film. The plot doesn't do too much to reinvent the wheel, but it's serviceable enough. Batman's trying to find a serial killer who is taking down corrupt members of the city government. In that way, the plot kind of reminded me of The Dark Knight. I'm sure this is a very common motif for Batman stories, but it's just kind of done again. Bruce does have an interesting motivation to be engaged in the plot early on, what with the first victim's son paralleling his experience very closely. With that said, one very minor place where the film falters is its characterization. I saw a Reddit comment saying that this feels like a sequel to a movie we never got to watch, and that feels pretty accurate. From a conventional movie standpoint, we don't get a lot of characterization on Bruce and Batman early on, but the fact is everyone watching this movie knows who this character is, so I think it can be excused in this movie, but it stood out to me. Even then, the other character elements felt a little hit or miss in their execution, ranging from really interesting and engaging to a little sloppily handled. I want to make this clear. I'm finding cracks in an otherwise fantastic tapestry, so don't jump down my throat. We don't get much character stuff for Bruce outside of like one scene until about 2 hours into the movie, and when it comes, it feels like the movie just stops for 20 or 30 minutes to get all the character stuff out of the way. I feel like the first 2 hours of the film are really well paced, but the last chunk of the movie is where it falters just a little bit. Like, there was a Bruce Wayne needs a father figure theme that felt a little underdeveloped. It just kind of pops up randomly in his scenes with Alfred, but it doesn't really play much of a role in other aspects of the film or its plot. In fact, Bruce Wayne as a whole is hardly in the film, really, and it focuses pretty steadily on the Batman, I guess tying into the film's title well enough. Okay, I know I'm the billionth person to make this observation, but how the hell do people not recognize him? When he's on public, people seem to easily recognize him as Bruce Wayne, but cover him from the nose up, and he's impossible to identify. It's far from a real criticism, but it's a kind of silly aspect to an otherwise fairly grounded film. Hey, I know. Let's play Guess the Vigilante. Can you guess who this is? What about this? Here's a tough one. Okay, one more. Did you get all of them? Sticking with Bruce, however, I do like other aspects of his arc. For instance, Batman evolves from being solely about vengeance to realizing he should be more of a symbol of hope. I also really liked how his privilege as a billionaire comes into play. A huge part of the Riddler's motivation deals with the fact that while he and Bruce were both orphans, their experiences were vastly different due to their socioeconomic differences. I love the scene where Bruce and Catwoman were discussing Catwoman's deceased friend. Bruce is like, well, she shouldn't have chosen to mess with those criminal types, and Selina says, choices? Whoever you are, you definitely grew up rich. I love that line and the fact that the film touched on those ideas in general, because it's true. We all have this view that people commit crimes because they're bad people and just choose entirely on their own volition to be criminals, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Your socioeconomic conditions play an unimaginably huge role in determining where you end up in life, and it's cool to see a big movie like this take such a modern and progressive view on the subject. Selina also refers to the bad guys getting iced by the Riddler as white privileged assholes, which I thought was kind of interesting. The only place where this theme takes a weird turn is when it decides to be pro-cop as well. This is a PG-13, but it's one of the harder PG-13s I've seen in a while. It definitely feels like a toned down R, tonally speaking. There's a lot of violence, sure, but there are other pretty dark elements as well. Brutal murders, political assassinations, drug use, and it's also very dark and grimy visually. This version of Gotham is dingy and gross, both inside and out. Overall, I liked the look of this Gotham, but it was just kind of brown and muddy. It was basically a copy-paste of New York City, and more specifically a 1980s New York City when everything was gross and crime rates were high. This is one place among a few where the movie felt somewhat connected to 2019's Joker, which also had that 1980s New York look and feel. It also dealt with themes of harsh socioeconomic conditions causing people to commit crimes. In addition, it paints Thomas Wayne in a similarly negative light. As for Gotham, I think its parallels to New York City were a little too on the nose. I mean, Gotham Square Garden. There's also a Times Square looking area and an Empire State Building stand-in with a big sign on it that's there to say, I'm not the Empire State Building, I promise. All in all, it's a cool setting, but it's so specifically New York City. I really enjoyed the action in this film as well. I'm not an action movie guy by any means, but when it's done well, I can appreciate it. The action in The Batman is appropriately brutal and visceral, but it's also well shot and well choreographed. There are plenty of cool set pieces, like the fight that's illuminated solely by gunshots. Not the first time it's been done, but it's definitely a high point. Okay. I know it's early on, but I think I'm going to say definitively that this movie has one of the top 5 best car chases of all time. For one, we get a cool rendition of the Batmobile. I'm as far and away from someone who cares about cool vehicles and stuff like that. I can see why others appreciate that sort of thing, but as a neutral observer, this was a neat prop that accompanies a fantastically executed car chase. I think I held my breath the entire time, which is rare in movies as an adult. Huge props to Matt Reeves and the crew, and I really want to say it's almost worth sitting through the entire 3-hour-long film just to watch that sequence. I kind of wish I could go see it in the theaters a second time just to watch that scene again. The way it was executed was truly second to none, and it elevated the movie's action to another level. The only slightly off thing about that scene is when it goes full schlock and Batman boosts off a car hauler's ramp over a bunch of wreckage. I'm gonna be honest, I think it was fun, but completely and utterly silly, and I honestly couldn't stop laughing for a little while after it happened. Not saying that it was bad or that it should have been cut, but I found it kind of hilarious. The other schlocky part was where Batman friggin' whips out a magical med pack from Knights of the Old Republic and injects himself with it. I'm sure it's meant to be, like, adrenaline, but he's like on the brink of death and he's just up and helping for hours and hours after that without needing any medical attention. Not a problem by any means, and I'm just kind of talking here, but there are a couple sillier moments that somewhat contrast with its more serious tone. People are comparing this movie to the likes of Seven, and I'd definitely agree in terms of its tone and story beats, but hell, it's pushing there in terms of quality as well. This is a really good movie in all the ways that count. Not every scene flows perfectly, and aside from some minor issues with its pacing and characterization, I found myself gripped from start to finish. Great performances and great action are just cherries on the top on what I would call one of the best superhero films of all time. With that said, even outside of the superhero genre, I think the film can stand on its own merits as a compelling action noir thriller. A lot of people say that about other superhero movies that try to be genre films, but I think this one may be the one that gets it right the best. Does anyone remember like 10 years ago when a bunch of cities had a few masked vigilantes pop up out of nowhere?
Are they superheroes or a super problem?
My city had perhaps the coolest one of all, the one and only Phoenix Jones.
Phoenix Jones calls himself a crime fighter. He's the man who dresses up and patrols the streets at night.
I endanger my life with a reason and a purpose.
You know, I wouldn't do it, and I ultimately don't see much of a point. I think they're endangering themselves more than anything, but a part of me has some level of respect for people who just want to keep their communities safe. I wonder whatever happened to Phoenix Jones. Is he still out there patrolling the streets, keeping the good people of Seattle safe? Oh, wow. Well, I guess you either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. What did you think of The Batman? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. That's a wrap.